Huh?
Do you get money for when they show that on TV?
Possibly. So you think the insurance will cover my witch doctor?
I would bet no, unless he actually kind of prescribes something.
Guy actually has a tribal license.
He's a licensed doctor.
From his tribe. I'm driving 50 minutes for this. It's going to be awesome. All right. So let's try to finish up our parser real quick, and hopefully today. And then we can start dealing with our voting dealio. So let's get us back to where we were. So we create a new parser, set the JSON, set the pause equal to 0. Then we call parse JSON. Parse JSON walks until we hit the opening curly brace, incrementing pause each time. As soon as we finished that, we have we're at the beginning of what? Actually, are we farther than this? JParser is our new one, right? Okay. Well, whatever. So once we get right here, we are past, we are sitting at the opening curly brace. Now we need to go ahead and read past that and capture our first variable, right? So JSON is an opening curly brace followed by a collection of 0 more variables followed by a closing curly brace. So when we call parse variable, we're going to set a variable name equal to whatever parse variable name returns. Here's parse variable name. We start off at the empty string. As long as we have not hit the opening double quote, we burn past spaces, so that gets us past white space. Then we grab the opening double quote. Then we keep concatenating on until we find the closing double quote. Then we actually grab the closing double quote, move one past it. Now we're looking for the colon, the guy that separates the variable name from the variable value. So we're going to keep going until we get to that. Move one past that. So pause, remember we're using pause as this global position of where we are in the string. Once we move one past the variable name, or once we move one past the colon, so the next thing we'd be looking for is the variable value, we'll return var name. So this is for parsing a variable. So this first line here gets the variable name. And when we get to the second line here where we're going to parse the variable value, we know we're already sitting one space past the colon, the thing that separates the variable name from the variable value. Okay, so parse variable value. Did we write that yet? I'm guessing this is where we were. But let's start off with parse variable value. Here's parse variable value. So parse variable value, we're going to keep going as long as we're not looking at a var val starter. So that means we're not looking at a double quote, a opening curly brace, or an opening square bracket. So we'll burn past white space here. Next thing you know, we're at the beginning of our value. So if I'm looking at a double quote, that means I'm dealing with a simple value. So we'll call this dot parse simple variable value. And that's this guy here. So we'll start off with our var value. This guy will be equal to that opening value, which should be the double quote, right? Then we'll move past that once. Then as long as we don't see the closing double quote, we'll just start building up our var value. Then we'll tack on that closing double quote under our var value, move one past the value, and return the var value. All right, so this parses the value out of a simple JSON value. Get the opening double quote, get everything in between, get the closing double quote, leave our position one after the variable ended, and then return the variable value. So that's from the parse simple variable value, which got called from our parse variable value. Now we start off making this void because we're going to have to probably deal with things as objects. All right, so somewhere did we create a JVar? That's not what it's going to end up being. What about a JVal? Yeah, this is what we were starting to write last time. So we're going to create an abstract class that we're not actually going to create an instance of. We're going to have a JSimpleVal, a J object val, and a JArrayVal, something like that. So our JSimpleVal, we can go ahead and create. So I'll create a new class, JSimpleVal. Do I?
Yeah.
Ha! See? I code so fast, I'm ahead of myself. JSimpleVal extends JVal. We're going to have the value, which in this case is just going to be a string. And to set the JSimpleVal, we'll set it to, we'll have the constructor will be a string variable. And we'll just set it. We'll add some more functionality to it here in a moment. We don't need JVar here. Let's go back to JParser. So when I get my parse simple variable value, that guy is going to return a string. We're going to have parse variable value now return a JVal. Where JVals come in three flavors. It comes in a JSimpleVal, a JObjectVal, and a JArrayVal, of which we've only written one of those so far. But this guy will return a JVal, which is why we made this abstract and then created other classes off of this that extend it. Okay? So, since we had to parse a simple variable value, we're going to return a new JSimpleVal, passing it the value that we just built. And then here at the very end for right now, just so it compiles for us, we'll return a null because this guy has to return a JVal. So right now I burn through white space. Now I'm at the beginning of the value. If it's a simple value, go and grab the value, use it to construct a new JSimpleVal and return that JSimpleVal. Else if JSON.char@pause is equivalent to an opening curly brace, that means it's a JObjectVal, right? Go ahead.
Isn't JVal an abstract class?
JVal is, yes.
How can you return?
Being abstract means I just cannot create an instance of it. I can return things that are JVals because JSimpleVal is a JVal, but we didn't create it using a JVal constructor. We created it using the JSimpleVal constructor.
Okay.
Make sense? It's kind of the purpose of abstract. It allows us to represent something generically that you could never actually create an individual instance of, but we can create JVals through JSimpleVals. Can never actually create an instance of JVal. It's impossible. But we can create things that are JVals through JSimpleVals, as well as we're about to create a JObjectVal. So now we're going to create another new class, JObjectVal. And this guy will be similar to JSimpleVal in that it extends JVal. So this will be a second way we can create instances of JVals without directly creating instances of JVals. All right. Now, what's a JObjectVal? When we think about JSON, we think about JSON objects. What is a JSON object? If you had to define that for me, what do they look like?
It's a collection of JVars.
collection of JVars, exactly. Where JVars could be other JObjects, it could be other JVals, collection of JVals.
No, JVars.
Oh no, JVars, name value pairs, where the values could be any of those three values. So let's bring up our JVar here. So our JVar, every variable has a name. We're cool with that. The only kinds of variable names that exist are strings. But our values come in the form of JVals, of which there's three flavors. So as he just said, a JObject val is a collection of JVars. Make sense? Where a JVar is a name followed by a JVal. Those two pieces of information. All right. So when we create a JSimple val here, actually let me do, well, we can bounce back to that in a second. When we create a JSimple val, what's the value going to look like? When we initially create a JSimple val, it's going to be empty. It's a collection of stuff. We need to then be able to add JVars to that collection. That makes sense? So the constructor for a JSimple val is not going to take anything as a parameter. And we won't have something for our, oh, I'm just destroying our good code because we actually want our JObject val, right? The constructor for our JObject val, public JObject val, isn't going to take anything as input. But we want to initialize a collection of JVars. So to have a collection of JVars, and since we don't necessarily know how many JVars we're going to have, probably do this as a linked list. So we'll have a private linked list of JVars. Call that the vars. You need to import java.util for a linked list. And then in here, we'll say the vars is equal to a new linked list of JVar. So that's what initializing a new JObject val will mean. All right, but now we need to have the ability to add a var to this collection. So we'll just quickly give ourselves that. So we're going to say public void add var. This guy will take in a jvar jv, and we'll say the vars.add jv. So we could take a JObject val, which is initially an empty collection of JVars, and we can store in there one variable at a time by adding to it. All right, so now if we go back to JParser, if I'm looking at a opening curly brace, that means I know for a fact I'm going to be dealing with a brand new JObject val. Okay, so for right now, we'll go ahead and create that empty object. Okay, but now we need to add stuff to this. We need to add a variable for every variable that we find. Well, how do we find a variable? By calling parse variable. That make sense? So we find a variable by calling parse variable. That's the next thing we should find. if we just ran into this guy, I know I need to move past that opening curly brace. We're not capturing that. We just know that we are now currently sitting in a sitting inside of the contents of the object, the J object. So I'll move past it by saying pause plus plus, but now I need to go and start capturing variables. As of right now, notice that parse variable up here currently returns a void. We're going to want this guy to return a JVAR. This guy builds JVARs for us. And what's a JVAR? A JVAR is a name and a JVal. So I can already build those. Currently, JVals come in two flavors. A simple JVal and a object JVal. So come back to JParser. We'll say JVal is equal to whatever this guy returns for parse variable value. Let's call that val. And now we can say return new JVar, passing it var name and passing it val. So parse variable's job is to ultimately build a JVAR. A variable, collection of a name and a value pair. The name is always going to be a string. The value will always be something of JVal type. And in the end, once we capture that, we'll go ahead and return that new variable. Parse variable name, this gets our name. Already dealt with that. And moves us one past it to be ready for the next, ready for the value. Then we have a parse variable value, which gets us past white space, then figures out what kind of value we're dealing with. In the event we were dealing with a simple value, we returned a new simple val. What's this complaining about right now?
I think you removed the argument in the JSON mobile.
Oh, I did. I didn't finish undoing my work there. That was when I was deleting the wrong class. All right, so this is one of our variable types, which is one of our val types, which is a JVal, but this is a JSimple val. Else, we're going to create a JObject val, move one past the opening curly brace. Now we need to collect all of the JVars in this JObject val. Does that make sense? Okay, well, how do we get one? Go ahead.
I don't think you're recording.
Yeah, I am.
You are?
Yeah,
Oh.
but I'm glad you said something. It's certain screens don't show it up there. It's like it's not even with Yosemite. It's something from
Yosemite.
Yosemite. It's not from Yosemite. It's been at least 2 versions of the operating system that happens on.
That's fair.
Better safe than sorry, though. See, you learned. It's like, say something. Say something. Like, why didn't you say something? Who noticed it first? Oh. All right, so I need to collect all the JVars that are associated with this JObject val. Well, I know how to get one JVar. I get one JVar by calling parse variable. But how do I know I'm done collecting JVars? So I can get one of them. So just for the sake of argument real quick, I'm going to say jov.addVar this dot, what do I call it? Parse variable. I know this will collect for me one variable. This already assumes that we at least have one variable in there. But how do I know I got them all? When we're dealing with a JSON object, we have an opening curly brace followed by a collection of variables, where variables come in any sort of format, followed by a closing curly brace. So we know we're done when we hit the closing curly brace to this opening curly brace. How do I know when that is? Go ahead.
You gotta count opening and closing curly braces, and then add one when you find an opening one.
We could possibly do it that way. You have to look at it where we are in the world right here. We're passing control over to other methods. So we're not walking through this one character at a time. We're relying on parse variable to go and get us the entire variable. We're also relying on the JSON to be accurate, but I think that's reasonable enough for our intents and purposes here. But we don't really have that opportunity to say, okay, I hit an opening curly brace, I hit another one, now it's 2, now it's 3, now it's closing, now it's 2, now it's 1. How do we do it without that, without the counting? After I read in one var, where am I sitting in my JSON?
Right after closing curly brace.
Okay? Either add a comma or closing curly brace. If it's a closing curly brace, I know I'm done. If it's a comma, I want to move past it and I want to read the next variable. Correct? Let's go back up here and see how we jumped into reading our first variable. Parse JSON, move to the opening curly brace. The very first thing we're going to find here in parse JSON is we want to parse a variable. Correct? Well, right now we're not doing anything with that. So it's almost like we're working backwards. Our original call to parse variable isn't here. Would you say that JSON is a collection of variables? It is. So isn't a JSON object the top level? Well, isn't JSON in its simplest form a JSON object? It is. So why not have a private JObject val? Call this guy the object. When we create a new JParser, we'll say the object is equal to a new JObject val. And similarly to what we're going to have to do later on, we're going to say this dot the object dot add this dot parse variable. And we need to keep doing this as long as something is true. As long as the same thing is true, well, we need to keep doing the other thing. Every single time we're parsing a JSON object, it's the same thing as parsing JSON, standard JSON. So we actually might have some overlap here. We might be able to make a recursive call to JSON parser. Why create two things when they're both the same thing? Okay, so let's see how deep that rabbit hole goes. So we know we're going to have to grab at least one variable, and we want to keep doing this as long as something is true. And what is that something? Well, when we haven't hit the corresponding closing curly brace. Now, after I read in one variable, I know I'm sitting at, and let's look at parse variable value real quick. Parse simple variable value, I need to make sure it leaves us after the thing. So we move past it, read it in, move past it. Okay, so we're good there. So this guy already naturally moves us past the closing double quote. This guy, we move past the opening on our own right here. So when we say add var, we call parse variable. Parse variable ultimately is going to call parse variable value, and our two flavors of parse variable value right now both leave our current cursor, the pause, right after the end of that variable, beyond the closing element, either closing double quote or the closing curly brace. We haven't dealt with the arrays yet. Okay, so I know that if I just write in a variable, the next thing that's going to happen is either A, I'm going to hit a comma, which means there's more. But what if I don't hit a comma? What if I hit a closing curly brace before I hit a comma? Well, let's ask this. I'm after the name of the value of a variable. Just read in a value. The possible things I could hit. Comma means there's more. White space, what do I do with white space? Skip it. What else could I possibly hit? Closing curly brace? Closing curly brace means what? Whatever it is, right? Either this particular variable's over or the whole JSON's over. That's where we have that overlap. Anything else I could hit in here? In what situation would I hit quotes? Well, the quotes in an object would surround the variable name or surround the simple variable values. But if I'm after a value, if I hit quotes, what would that mean I'm looking at? Well, a new variable name. But can a new variable name come before a comma? Comma says there's more. If I hit a double quote before I hit a comma, that means that it's bad, poorly formed JSON. Right? It's not legal JSON. Okay, so a comma means I'm definitely ready for more. That's definitely what we're looking for to find out, do we need to parse another var? But if I hit something else other than a comma that's not white space, I know I'm done. Correct? And I need to move past it. So I need to start after I read in a variable here. Would you say I have to read in at least one variable? So we'll read in our variable. Then we need to potentially read in more. Now, actually, I'm not gonna do this as a do while loop, just because this otherwise is gonna end up being more convenient. I might still do it as a do while loop, but I want to make sure it's explainable, easily explainable first. So I'll go ahead and add my first var. We know that's there. We can debate later whether it's legal JSON as to whether or not we allow a JSON object to have nothing in it, for there to be an empty object. For right now, we're going to say there's at least one variable. All right, so we'll add that var. Now we need to walk looking for the next stuff. We know that adding a var, calling parse variable, will leave us at the spot immediately following that value. Whether it's white space, whether it's a comma, it'll be past the closing double quote or the closing curly brace. Okay, so we don't need to worry about accidentally looking at that closing character of a value. So now I need to walk until I hit something good, hit something that's meaningful. So if I'm looking at white space, I'm skipping it, right? So right off the bat, let's throw this in here. While I'm not looking at a starter, I can go through. But is this even accurate? Not looking at a starter says what? Says it's not an opening curly brace. It's not a opening square bracket. It's not a double quote. Oh, and this was for our dumb values, our white space. So actually this will cover. This will cover white space. Where am I at here? All right, so while I'm not looking at anything that starts a new variable, keep walking. If I'm here, I'm looking at something, right? Now that something could be a comma. That something could be a closing curly brace. For right now, that's our options, what it could be. All right. Now remember, I'm inside of JVal right here, parse variable value. So if I'm looking at something, if JSON.charAt pause is equal to a closing curly brace, what do I want to do? Pause plus plus. That moves us past that, right? And we know that we just hit the end of our object variable, our value, right? So we want to return that value, jval. So we'll say pause plus plus, and we'll say return JOV. Make sense? What if I'm not? I'm looking at something. It's not a closing curly brace. Must be a comma. Here we can do, for right now, just to make it explicit, why don't we say else if JSON.charAt pause is equal to a comma, just so we can see it. If I'm looking at a comma, that means there's more. What do we do if there's more?
Move past the call parse variable.
Move past it, so that's the pause plus plus. And then we want to call parse variable.
Well, add another. Add
Say this again.
I think you want to add another variable by calling parse variable. So that line there.
This line right here,
Yeah.
right? So here we go, Abe. We're going to do that. Oh, but there's going to be a trick here. Wow, what is true? How long are we going to keep doing that? Interesting programming. We want to keep doing this as long as we haven't run into a comma. No, as long as we continue to run into commas, right? We're checking for commas right here. In our code right here.
So while you don't return.
How about while true? So keep doing this indefinitely, or at least until I force our way out of here. All right. So we'll go ahead and read our first variable. Got our first variable. Good to go. Burn through anything that's not, we'll burn through all our white space. Then, if I'm looking at the end of the object, return JOV. What does return statement do? Immediately makes a method end, right? So we don't need to worry about breaking out of our loop there. Method just ended. We returned our JVal. Else, if I'm looking at a comma, we'll move past the comma. Then do what? Spin back up to this do. Call parse variable. Do I have to actually break out of this loop? Or does this guy self-break right now? When I'm done with this object, I leave. The return statement gets me out of it, as it's written right now. Make sense? All right. So as far as this value goes, this guy will keep reading in values as long as there is still a So, given this, whenever I'm dealing with JSON, we said a few minutes ago that JSON in its most simple form is a JSON object, correct? Right now, when I call parse JSON, what's parse JSON doing? It's looking for that opening curly brace, right? Then it's calling add var. Is the first thing that parse JSON should do is do that, or can I just call parse variable first? Or maybe you call, actually parse variable is what you'd have to call. So when I say parse JSON, rather than burning through white space, parse variable name, that burns through white space, right? Oh, the one thing we don't deal with is we don't have a variable name. So I need to get parse variable value, parse object value. Did we write that somewhere? Oh, it's written in here. So I need to call parse variable value for that first guy. So what this guy will do right at the beginning, parse JSON says this dot the object is equal to this dot parse variable value. And we happen to know that even though this guy is going to come out as a generic JVal, we know it will be a JObject_val. Okay, so parsing JSON will mean get the value associated with the original JSON object that does not have a variable name. Okay, because that's what a JSON document is. It's a JSON object. So that's what that'll do. We'll get that original variable value. Keep in mind, so we're just kind of walking through a fresh set of JSON here. The very first thing we're going to run into here is variable value. We'll burn through all of our white space. We happen to know that we're going to hit this production, this version of our if statement. I hit an opening curly brace because that's how all JSON starts, right? Basic JSON document will start with an opening curly brace. So that's the guy I'm going to hit. So I'm going to create a new JObject_val. Remember I said we know it's a JObject_val, not just a JVal. So there's our JObject_val. Pause plus plus. We'll fill it up with all the objects that are in there. Now remember, this is where the recursion comes in. As long as I had something, keep adding stuff. Does that make sense? So let's go down the rabbit hole here. If I'm looking at a closing curly brace there, that could be the ending curly brace for our JSON object, or the whole JSON document, which is a JSON object. How do we know it's not the closing curly brace of a JSON object inside of a JSON object inside of a JSON object? Inside of a JSON object.
The recursion takes care of that.
Recursion should take care of it. Okay, so it's built into the logic here. When I first call this guy, the very first time through, I'm going to hit my opening curly brace at the very beginning of my JSON document. I'll create my new JObject_val, which is going to, the very first one will be set equal to our the object, the guy at the top. Then I'll go ahead and get the first variable inside that. So parse variable is a recursive call. It's one little line of code, well, somewhat of a recursive call. I'm calling another function to do something, okay, which ultimately might come back and call this function, but not this version of this function. I might call another call to parse variable value. You know, so if we think about JSON, we might have a situation so we might have blah. Let's just keep our names short. So variable name A is actually equal to an object that has a variable name B, which is actually equal to an object which has a variable name C, which is actually equal to cat. So that would be legal JSON here, right? So right off the bat, we're going to get the value. See, notice this very first thing. This is a JSON object value, correct? It's the only JSON object value that does not have a variable name associated with it. So the top level one does not have a variable name. It's the JSON document we're parsing. So we're going to start walking through this guy. We see, you're a JSON object. So we're going to go ahead and deal with you. So what's the first thing we do? Parse variable. So we're going to call parse variable. We'll grab the variable name associated with that guy, then burn past the colon, then get its value. This guy's value, JSON object. Parse variable. Burn past this. Get its value. What kind of value? JSON object. Get its variable name. Burn past the colon. Get its value. What kind of value? JSimple value. Get that. Then we hit the closing curly brace. So just stopping right here. I just finished reading in our JSimple value here. Okay, so we return that value. And that was called from this line right here. So we got that value. Then, as long as we're not looking at a starter, now it says I'm looking at something. What am I looking at right here? That's pause right now. What am I looking at? Closing curly brace. What do we do if I'm looking at a closing curly brace? If I'm looking at a closing curly brace, increment it by 1, and then return this value. So that means increment by 1, return the value you just did. Now, we're at the previous call. Burn through anything. So is it true that the first thing I'm looking at is not a starter? So is var val starter? So is the current character I'm looking at either a opening curly brace? Here, what's the
Opening square bracket.
curly brace, opening square bracket, double quote, or space? Is it true that it's not one of those? So what should I be doing? What does this guy say to do? Where's that line? Yep, right here. What does it say to do if it's not one of those? Increment pause. Right now, I'm looking at something that's not one of those. Do I want to increment pause? I don't. I need it to fail on this. I'm already where I need to be. This guy will burn me through white space, won't it? But what happens when I hit that closing curly brace? So I'm going to hit it initially. I'm looking at an empty space. Okay. Will this return true? Just what I have highlighted here. If I'm looking at an empty space, it will. That'll be true. Not true is what? Not true is false. False will make a loop end. What does that while loop currently say to do? What's the logic that that while loop tells us to do?
While we're not looking at the beginning of a variable, keep going.
Yeah, well, we're not looking at the beginning of a variable. Well, actually, is that even true? Beginning of a variable would also be the double quote, which could also be the end. What do I actually want to do in this case? In this case, I want to make a special move when I know I'm at the end of an object. Do we explicitly ask that question? Do we just say, am I looking at the end of an object? And respond to it? Is this still legal JSON? It is. So potentially I'm sitting right here, right now.
Could you just add closing curly brace to your list of things that you don't burn past?
We can. Probably don't want to put it inside that method because then that method kind of means less than it used to mean.
Just add it on to that particular.
Yep. So in this particular one, while it's not one of these, and JSON.char at pause is not equal to a closing curly brace. Keep going. That make sense? Then we're looking at something. If it was a closing curly brace, we're done. Let's move past it and return that value. So in this case, we burn, fall out of it. No, we're done with that object. Now what I want to do here is I want to throw a comma in here, just for testing purposes. All right, so I'll stop it right here. Remind me to pick up. We're finishing testing this one part. We're pretty much done with this at this point. We'll just have to have a display method for our J object. So I'll see everybody on Wednesday.